Yeah, the title, Looking Good, that was, I guess, there we go. I was trying to think about looking good. Like, in a way, it's everything I don't want to do. Like, I don't want things to be nice, I don't want things to be cool, or whatever. So I was thinking about the title, and I was thinking maybe it's about looking, like the way you see things and the kind of cultural ideas bound up with that. And then maybe good, like what does good mean? Maybe good is a moral idea or an ideological point of view. So thinking about these kind of takes on the thematic title, of course I turned to the saintly John Berger. And here he is to give us his idea about what it is to see from ways of seeing, obviously.
The process of seeing paintings or seeing anything else is less spontaneous and natural than we tend to believe. A large part of seeing depends upon habit and convention. All the paintings of the tradition used the convention of perspective, which is unique to European art. Now, perspective centers everything on the eye of the beholder. It is like a beam from a lighthouse, only instead of light traveling outwards, appearances travel in. And our tradition of art called those appearances reality.
Thank you, John. Yes, so what he's saying, in a sense, is that the way we look constructs the world as much as the world constructs the way we look. And I think we can kind of understand that maybe more clearly in art, but I think it's as true for architecture as well. So I'm going to show a few projects, different kinds of scales, uses, etc., different types of projects. And each has an idea about how we see the world, the way we see the world, and how that structures the worlds that we create. And I'm going to start with something very direct. It picks up on perspective that John Berger is talking about, the power of the vanishing point, conceptually. It was an exhibition called Disappear Here. An exhibition about perspective and about how looking, or structures of looking, theories of looking, construct space. That space is not normal and natural, it's something which is made. So just to recap, I'm sure you know perspective, but here we have a blank sheet of paper. Flat, no depth. Then we draw a line, the horizon. Then we put the magic dot, the vanishing point, which is the kind of mysterious power that occurs within the scopic regime of perspective. And perspective, as John Berger says, everything disappears into it or comes from it, one of the two. So here the page starts to have depth. Magically, something flat becomes deep. And then using that system, we can draw objects in it. And that object becomes kind of real. It's like we imagine how we see the world. And then we can turn it into pictures. But, of course, perspective is not real. It's not true. It's not how we see. And there have been many other, and remain many other ways of understanding the space of the world. So, for example, cave paintings have a different idea of space. Byzantine art has a different, flatter idea of space. Medieval art begins to think about perspectival issues, but in a very different way to how we understand it. And we understand it from this moment when the kind of mathematics of linear perspective was proved. So in Florence in the 15th century, Brunelleschi's famous experiment where he paints a picture of the Florentine baptistry, you can see him with his painting there, with a hole in the back of it, and a mirror he holds in front of the painting. And when he looks through that little hole, he sees the painting and the real world merge together. And thus, perspective is proved to be an analogue of the world. And since then, perspective has become a kind of, we accept it as a normal, natural idea of what space is. It's a default on, 3D programs, put it into perspective. But behind that, normality, remains something weird and mysterious, and perhaps something which tells us about the world that we live in. It's a perspectival world, we just live in it. So this was a show which was using existing architectural drawings from two collections, from the RIBA collection and from the Drawing Matter collection. They were all selected because they used perspective. So kind of 500 years of architectural drawing, different kinds of projects, different authors, different purposes, but all obeying the same rules. And the approach was to try to show this mysterious power of perspective. So by taking one image, one drawing, with its one-point perspective here, it begins to position the other drawing so that you start having the power of the vanishing point affecting things outside its frame. So these are pairs, but then it gets more complicated, or a bigger web that gets woven between these drawings, which are separate things but also connected, you could say. So this is a very fast elevation where you also see the space of the gallery is painted, projected back into the wall, using the vanishing points of the drawings which are hung on the wall. So it's a kind of, I guess, a way of merging what we think of as representation with, let's say, real space. Some shots of the exhibition. You can see here, this is two Italian radicals separated by 500 years, Superstudio and Palladio, for example. Very different, but obeying the same rules of perspective. So things are flat, things are three-dimensional. You begin to be organized by the drawings on the wall. You begin to be organized by the space. So the representation becomes something which is really present, etc., etc. Now this is also, I suppose, linked to, this is Erwin Panofsky's Perspective as Symbolic Form, an amazing text which talks about the invention of perspective. He claims that perspective could only have been invented in Florence in the 15th century because a certain idea of the universe, a certain idea of God changed, which allowed the conceptual invention of the vanishing point. But we could also say that it was also to do with trade and banking. It was very important to know how much stuff there is and where is it, which, of course, provided the funds which allowed the art to happen. Perspective's also linked to other forces, so you can track the same kind of concepts through other technologies, so through the technologies of navigation, the camera lucida, camera obscura, etc., etc., which still are with us today. So perspective is also linked to, let's say, the exploration, European expansionism, the claiming of territory, but it's also linked to technologies of cameras. For example, CCTV, the way that we're observed in the city. And you could say somehow perspective is a conceptual frame which has exerted its own idea of how the world should be organized. So perspective is not just a way of drawing the world, depicting it. It's not an open window, as Alberti said. It's actually a far more powerful force that traps us within its own conceptual idea of what the world is. Here we are, trapped in the vortex of perspective. So I want to talk now a little bit about how ways of looking, ways of seeing, become a system for organizing space in a very direct way, a set of rules that structure the world. This is a project for the Science Museum in the UK for their collections centre. So all the stuff which is not on show in their many museums. And this is some of that stuff. This is before. This is where all their objects were stored in various places. Pretty chaotic. They didn't even know exactly what they had, how many they had, what they were. You can see it's kind of chaotic, right? Sometimes a bit less chaotic, but you know. And they own an airfield. They have owned an airfield for a long time, where they had hangars from World War II, where they would store stuff in an ad hoc manner. Things that have been to space, things that have been to the bottom of the sea, things that have been to Antarctica, but also very everyday things like a bus, a car, a chocolate bar. This is the airfield, and they had built on this airfield the biggest, cheapest building they could possibly afford. Zero architectural quality in, let's say, the capital A architecture. Of course, interesting in so many other ways, like a distribution center. Huge, huge, huge. 90 meters wide, 300 meters long. And this is a shot of the space within it. Now, our job was to try to help them organize this stuff and put it into that big hangar. So it's a kind of a project about organization. We began thinking about, this is really a project about science, the ordering of things. So here is a kind of, here is the sum of human knowledge. Here's one way of organizing it. Here's the first periodic table. So you could think of the scientific project as a way of structuring knowledge. We saw our job as a way of structuring objects, structuring collections. We felt there was something a little bit about, maybe how the periodic table meets a system of drawing by someone like Sol LeWitt. And it produced this big graphic that could be painted onto the floor of the warehouse. And here it is, painted onto the floor of the warehouse. So through color, through shape, it begins to map a kind of an idea of space, a way of organizing things into space. This is it blank. And then the second part of the project was to try to arrange objects within that grid that we created. So here are layouts where we're putting missiles and buses and cars into groups. And of course, this also has to be something which can be, a collection store is endlessly in motion. Things are coming in, coming out, going on display, having conservation, those kinds of things. But we thought of it a little bit like town planning as well, like urban planning, like an interior urbanism of objects. So you can see here, smaller to bigger, a kind of picturesque layout of industrial objects. And this is a video. There's so many objects. There's over 300,000 objects. It took them 2.5 years to move the objects. And this is a little time lapse of some of that process. So you can see big objects coming in, crates of smaller things which then go onto racking. And you can also see the kind of strangeness of the combination of objects that they have. Historical, military, a lot of logistics, you could say. I mean, this place is so big that small objects, like cars, are put on shelves. You can see some of them going up on the racking on the back wall there. So it's big. And this is it when they've managed to fit everything in. A double-ended car that you can drive both ways, for example. Very, very early electric car. An incredible collection. Not designed for people, only designed for objects. So it's not like a museum. There's no interpretation. You can only visit as part of a tour, so a little bit like a kind of, you know, like James Bond in one of those films where he like sneaks off. And then, of course, we did some things to make it a little bit more pleasant for people, especially the people who have to work there, with landscaping on the front of the building. This is another kind of organization. It's a conceptual proposal for a tower in Chicago, a site where there's been many conceptual proposals for towers. But if the collection center is a horizontal organization, this is more of a vertical kind of organization. And it also relates to a sense of archive. So here we are. This is the Chicago Tribune Tower. The one on your right is the one that got built, Raymond Hood. And the one on the left is one of the famous proposals for the competition, Adolf Loos's column, a kind of joke, right? Chicago Tribune's a newspaper, and this is a newspaper column. Get it? Yeah. At the base of the real Chicago Tribune Tower is something very strange. It's studded with pieces of other buildings. So a piece of Notre Dame, a piece of the Alamo, a piece of the Twin Towers, etc., etc. And maybe this is a kind of an idea of the newspaper, at least the kind of 20th century idea of the newspaper. Something international, something with connections in lots of different places, all centralized to the headquarters of the newspaper. We began using that suggested archive as a way of structuring a tower, slices of the cues which are in the base of the building. So these were some early tests, like a kind of exquisite corpse of architecture. So that rather than just being rhetorical, these references to other buildings become a mechanism of producing a building itself. So here it is on Michigan Avenue. I think it's a good idea for a skyscraper, right? I can't believe it's not built. And this is it as a gigantic model, but you can see, you know, slice to slice to slice, how these different references are brought together. You could say in this case, it's very much about the collage. It's about the break. One thing, another thing, another thing, another thing, which you could think, which is, I suppose, one way of structuring difference. When you bring together lots of different references, there's questions about how you resolve that. Do you want it to read as an assemblage of parts, or do you want it to become a new thing in and of itself? What Americans, at least in American schools, always like to call the part-to-whole relationship. I don't think anyone ever says that in Europe, but so yeah, you can see piece, another piece on top, another piece on top. So this is a form of, I suppose, collage and a form of stacking, sometimes putting one thing inside another. So then I wanted to show a different way of dealing with differences. So how do you, let's say, take a whole set of references and begin to treat them in a way where they can begin to fuse, they can produce a hybrid. So in a sense, how you might synthesize difference. And I want to start with this guy. He's called Thomas Fairchild, and he was the first person to scientifically hybridize a plant. So he took he took a carnation and a sweet william, one on either side, and brushed the pollen from one into the stamen of the other. And then a year later, the plant in the middle, which was the original specimen, grew and flowered. So I suppose this begins to think about what happens when you take different references and you begin to merge their DNA and they become something else. This was the nursery where he looked after plants and where in the early 18th century he produced the flower, which was called the Fairchild's mule. Mule, because like a mule, it itself cannot reproduce. So there's an interesting idea, I think, about how you might think of genetics as a way of bringing together different, let's say, familial qualities. But this nursery happened to be on the site of the project, which I'm going to show you, and therefore it gave the name to the project, the Hoxton Mule. Itself a kind of hybrid, a crossbreeding of very different kinds of references. It's in a kind of a part of London which is very historic, but has gone through a lot of change. So you can see it here from the 18th century to the 21st century, and you can see the street pattern evolving and then drastically changing. So if I run through it again, very early you can see buildings as objects. Then you see it as part of the Victorian city, where it becomes a very typical London situation of terrace streets, very dense. But by the 1950s, a lot of that had been cleared. So you have this sort of hybrid condition in an urban sense, partly objects, partly terrace, some things remaining, some things demolished, so that the urban grain itself is almost like it's collapsing or falling apart. And I think this also provides some of the setting for decisions that are made in the project. This was the site, was the building, an old pub, the Victorian pub, in a terrible state, being propped up by very large pieces of wood, the brick bowing. But it had been a community centre since the 1960s, so no drinking, sadly. This had been the historic form of the city, so Victorian terraced housing, very Dickensian. And this is a kind of contemporary setting, so it's a mixture of this kind of stuff, which is, I don't know what this is. It's a weird hybrid. It's part retail, deck access, but very big deck access, residential. It's a very odd, kind of vernacular, you could say. A lot of strange urban features like blank walls, which I think is a function of, let's say, the tearing apart of the city. As you reveal flanks, you reveal edges which were never supposed to be edges. But a very interesting idea, I think, the blankness in the city. But then also objects. So objects, Victorian schools or 1950s housing, objects defining space. So some of those are kind of, let's say, the catalogue of the archive of place, very specific to that place. And then this is, let's say, the archetypes archive. Melnikov, Hayduk, Toyo Ito, some of the references. And in some senses, the project is about bringing together these different sets of interests. One incredibly local, incredibly vernacular, and one, you could say, high architecture, at least of a certain kind. Or on a site which is U-shaped. And that U was never real. The U was only ever drawn on a plan by a planner. It was never an organic function of the city being made. So this U seemed very interesting, and we began to use the U itself. We used it. We built to the site boundary, we built another U, we built another U, we built another U. We'll see how many U's there are. So a kind of lack of idea in terms of the plan becomes a kind of strength, you could say. In the building itself, there's a fusion of functions, so it's residential on top and community centre on the ground and the basement. There's a kind of fusion of these two forms, so a kind of hybrid programmatically, but also, as you can see, a kind of hybrid of architectural references, all rendered in a kind of local, brick, Londonish manner. But unlike the Chicago pasticcio, rather than slice, 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 rather than collage, these are brought together as a kind of hybrid, much more in the manner of Fairchild's mule. You can see it within its strange urban context, objects, field, somewhere between the two. You can see blankness at certain points and incredible interest at other points. And the ways in which these elements come together, the step of the wall which slides into the hole, and the U. Okay, here comes the U. So you have the U of the building itself, which you walk up to the house along that U, inside, and then you get turned 90 degrees, and then there's an internal U, which is the circulation, which takes you up. So you go up, up a U again, and then you find another U. And then you come up the U and find yourself in a smaller U. So U, 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 U. Another U on the gate. Also hybridized, you could say, with Studio 54 logo, as disco as security. Here we are walking up inside the U. You're in a deep cavern of brick, but you come up, now you're higher up. The U inside, U, 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 U. The space in the building is a kind of a product, you could say, of the kind of urban condition, which you then begin to inhabit. So rather than it being kind of designed for anything, it occurs. So you're inside the big U space. With different ways of kind of navigating that space. Things get repeated, so you have a circular window, you have a circular mirror, you have a curved brick wall, you have a brick shower curtain which takes up curves, and even in the kitchen where you open the cupboards with a little metal version of the site plan itself. The U returns once more. So it's a kind of synthesized object, you could say, bringing together forces of history, references, into a new object which then sits within the context which partly generated it itself. For the Victoria and Albert Museum, this is for the entrance, very grand entrance, itself a building which talks about stuff. It's very direct, it's very narrative. It's so narrative, it has sculptures on it which tell you who is important, tells you about Queen Victoria, it has a version of her crown on top of it. But it also has an idea of use. It's an applied arts museum, but it has a tradition of functional things taking on cultural purpose. So rooms, cafe rooms designed by William Morris, amongst others, but also collections. Clearly, the museum has collections. This is the glassware collection, or a part of it, which was then used for some of the choices which were made in the design. So this entrance lobby, which uses glass tubes of various sizes, reflecting, you could say, the curatorial aspects of the museum, but also introducing the effects that glassware has. Into the toilets, very functional, which also carry on a kind of curatorial aspect. So working with curators to take figures from the ceramics collection and then reproducing them at the most private and, let's say, least cultural, or supposedly least cultural, part of the museum itself. Josiah Wedgwood, very important figure in the establishment of the museum itself. Here he is holding one of his celebrated pots, and here are his jasperware pots. Very beautiful ceramics with the color all the way through. It's not glaze, it's the whole stuff itself. So we tried to work with the Wedgwood factory, and we collected waste, this stuff, from the production line, crushed it, being crushed. It's almost painful, right, watching that? Like, but also pleasurable. Like, imagine the museum is supposed to stop pots being smashed. That's its first job. But so smashing pots in order to make something for a museum is kind of fun. And that became a terrazzo that was used for the walls. Now, I'm just going to quickly show you this one. It's a project also about seeing, about how seeing constructs the world. The most photographed barn in America. How looking constructs reality. And it's, let's say, inspired or stolen from White Noise by Don DeLillo. Fantastic novel. There's a passage in it, which I'll read a bit of it in a second, about the most photographed barn in America, which it turns out is real. This is the most photographed barn in America. It's near Jackson Hole in Wyoming. And these are some of the, let's say, over 300 images we stole from the internet of the most photographed barn in America. So many, many low-res, bad pictures of the barn. We used those photos using photogrammetry software to kind of try to reconstruct the most photographed barn in America. So here we are in the process of doing that. Producing these kinds of models. So I think what's important to remember here is this is not a model of the barn, it's a model of photographs of the most photographed barn in America. So it's a project about how, I suppose, seeing constructs an image of the barn. You can see architecture, landscape gets very confused. It's very partial. All the photos are from one position. And then these are the models which are produced from that software. So to varying degrees, a kind of fluid idea of a barn in some kind of flux. And if you'll let me, I'll just read the I'll just read a bit of Don DeLillo. So this is a passage from it. So one character says, "Once you've seen signs about the barn, it becomes impossible to see the barn." He fell silent once more. People with cameras left the elevated site, replaced by others. We're not here to capture an image, we're here to maintain one. Every photograph reinforces the aura. Can you feel it, Jack? An accumulation of nameless energies. There was an extended silence. The man in the booth sold postcards and slides. Being here is a kind of spiritual surrender. We see only what the others see. The thousands who were here in the past, those who will come in the future. We've agreed to be part of a collective perception. It literally colors our vision. A religious experience, in a way, like all tourism. Another silence ensued. They are taking pictures of taking pictures, he said. And while that's a description of tourists taking photographs, I think it's, in a way, a very good description of what it is to make architecture. We're always making architecture about making architecture. Thank you very much.